Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Ben Moraine. I'm the Executive Director of the New Israel Fund of Canada. We're delighted to be in Temple Sholom once again. We were here a year ago when we were even deeper into the war, when October 7th was even fresher in our pain. And there has been no shortage of more events that have happened since then. I want to apologize on behalf of Rabbi Dan Moskowitz. He wanted to be here to greet you all. He's feeling a little under the weather. His family had a recent Shiva, so he says that he is here in spirit, and that we should proceed without him all the same. So it's a delight to be here. I think back to when we were here a year ago, just over a year ago. We brought, other speakers that were also Israeli, also with progressive values, also speaking about alternatives that could be instead of what was happening. And we're doing that again today. In these times, when the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has proceeded to break our hearts again and again and again, and when the Israeli government has not provided any of the leadership, whether moral or otherwise, who do we look to? Who do we look to for some sense of what is the value of the Jewish state? What is Israeli society capable of? What are its good parts? What are its strengths? What direction is it heading in? For us, we have always looked to Israeli civil society, those forces within Israel who took this startup nation with, at the time, pretty mediocre women's rights, no gay rights, no minority rights, and built something closer to a liberal democracy. Tooth and nail, slowly, decade by decade, over time, and often over the greatest objections of the people who ran the country at the time. That is how we see Israel. Israel didn't emerge from the sand of the Mediterranean as the country with the best gay rights in the Middle East. That's not the story of Israel. The story of Israel is the story of progressives who are both Jewish and Palestinian, many of whom work together, fighting for some of the same things that we fight for here, that we fight for, that our parents fight for, that our grandparents fought for. This is how we see Israel. And so in these times, these especially dark times, these are also the voices that we look to in Israel now to provide answers and maybe even a little bit of hope. By way of introduction, the New Israel Fund is the largest supporter of civil, social, and human rights organizations in Israel. Half of what we do is funding organizations, and half of what we do is organize civil society in order to do its work better. We're, without shame, the most important force in Israel fueling and empowering civil society that believe in democracy, equality, and, yes, peace. We put our money where our values are. For example, we simultaneously fund the Israeli hostage families in their quest to get their own government to prioritize a hostage deal, while at the same time we fund Israeli human rights organizations advocating for Palestinians in the Gaza and the West Bank. We were among the first to provide humanitarian aid to the devastated southern Israeli communities after October 7th. And we were the first mainstream Jewish Zionist organization to raise funds for food for starving Gazans. In a world gone black and white, we insist that we can always care for both. And indeed, the only way out is together. The only way to Israeli safety is to achieve safety for the Palestinian people too. Before October 7th, we were the largest force supporting the pro-democracy movement in Israel. And since the start of this horrible war on October 7th, we have funded and organized the forces in Israeli civil society who present an alternative to the current government's vision, and also an alternative to despair. We have raised millions more dollars from tens of thousands of new supporters around the globe, including here in Canada, and poured new funding into new programs that demonstrate Jewish-Arab partnership when it feels impossible, to protect democratic institutions when it feels impossible, to block annexation of the territories when it feels insurmountable, and that build, despite the odds, a long-term constituency for a diplomatic solution to this horrible war and for a better future. That is what we do, and that is the guiding star that guides our way. The reason we're here tonight is to deepen our understanding of where is Israeli society right now, where are Palestinians, and where, despite the odds, is there a small pathway through the quagmire to a better future. We're lucky to have our guest speaker here tonight to help us deepen and maybe reset our understanding of Israeli society in some good ways and some bad ways. There's good news and there's bad news in this. And most surprisingly, some things haven't changed at all. I'm really glad to have Dahlia Scheindlin here. Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin. She's, we like to call her one of our besties at the New Israel Fund. She's a political scientist, a public opinion expert, a political consultant. She's a fellow at the Century Foundation. Many of you must know her extensive writing in Haaretz, English, covering politics, the conflict, and foreign affairs. You've seen her byline in like nearly every important newspaper around the world. She's advised 9 political campaigns in Israel on those issues. She's also got regional expertise in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, in case one ethnic conflict is not enough. And transitional expertise in transitional democracies in 15 countries beyond Israel, which is why you should look up her book, The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, which she just published recently. She's one of the founders of 972 magazine, has co-hosted a number of podcasts with other publications. She's a board member of A Land for All, which is a grantee of the New Israel Fund, dealing with the two-state solution. And A Land for All should hold a special place in the hearts of Canadians, because the Jewish and Palestinian young women leaders of that organization just received the Vivian Silver Impact Award just a few months ago. Dahlia is also one of us, a Canadian. So with that, Dahlia, why don't you come up? Dahlia will share her insights and present to us, and then we'll take questions and answers. And then at the end, I'll close up, and you all are welcome to stay for an oneg, little desserts in the back room. So Dahlia, please come up and give us the bad news and the good news. Give it to us straight.
First, most important thing. So thank you, Ben, for this very kind introduction. Thank you, everybody, for hosting me and for coming to hear some of the bad news and the good news. It's before I bombard you all with data, I just want to say I sort of wish I could be here in the position of being the person to explain why there's hope and inspire everybody about the possibilities for moving ahead towards ending the war, ending the conflict, moving towards political resolution. And I can do that, but what I'm here to do tonight is first give you the lay of the land. I think that it's really impossible to look forward unless you really know where you are now. And I think one of the problems we've seen from October 7th and onward in Israeli society is just how much people were not reading reality correctly before October 7th. It's one of the reasons why we're in this situation. So I am, going to show you some difficult data. In fact, the main thing is that I'm going to show you a lot of data. But what I want to try to convey is where Israeli society is now during the war. What has the war done to Israeli attitudes? And I'm going to put that in the context also of Palestinian attitudes. And I'm already going to give you some of my, bottom line convictions about how we should look at this region, one of which is that I don't think we should be looking at Israelis alone or Palestinians alone. We're two people, we're sharing a very small space, and I think that we should realize at this point that we really can't understand one without the other. So the focus is on Israeli opinion here, but I will show you also some of the Palestinian data. And I'm going to go through quite a bit of it, but I will point out what I think, is what I'd like you to try to take away from this, and then we'll open it up to conversation. I'm going to break this down into three main topics. Okay, first, where people are during the war. And here you have a few of the bottom line takeaways, which you can start to internalize, but I'm going to show this to you through the data so that you don't have to just trust me. You'll see the numbers yourself. One is that wartime trends make people hardline. Okay, if you ever hear people say, well, our side or their side only understands force, and that's what makes them compromise, from a public opinion perspective, that's not what I see in the data. What I see is that when there's escalations, when there's war, people become more hardline, more militant, less compromising, less conciliatory. Then I want to step back a little bit and show you some of the longer term trends. Okay, how did we get to this situation of extremely negative perspectives? I'll go through some of the trends from recent years with relation to attitudes towards peace, attitudes towards the two-state solution, and you'll see the decline over time that brought us to this stage. And then I'm calling the last part counter trends. I mean, I've deliberated about whether to call it opportunities and maybe openings. I've used the word openings as well. But we have to be pretty cautious about where things are. But these are the kinds of trends that go a little bit against the grain of the harder trends that you're going to see in the first couple of parts. So let me also give you a bit of the technical background. What I'm going to show you is mostly data drawn from a long-term project that I conduct together with a Palestinian colleague. We call this the Joint Israeli-Palestinian Survey. It's basically the same questionnaire with questions adapted for Israelis and Palestinians. That project has existed since the year 2000, so it's a 25-year-old project. I joined as the Israeli researcher in 2016. Most of the data you're going to see tonight is drawn from the survey we conducted in July 2024. So it's during the war, about 8 months into the war, roughly. And I'll show you some of the longer-term trends from this same project because we have a lot of longitudinal trends. If not marked otherwise, the data is from this survey. And the reason I'm showing you this really boring methodology slide, which maybe you can't even see that far because it's a little bit small, but this is just to point out that anytime you read a survey, you should be looking to see if it tells you the methodological information. Otherwise, I would be cautious about trusting it. But we're looking at representative sample of Palestinians, representative sample of Israelis. And since we're focusing more on the Israeli side, let me just explain the sample. This is a sample that represents Israeli Jews, Arab citizens or Palestinian citizens of Israel. And we did oversamples. We added extra people from settlers in the West Bank and the Arab citizens so that we would have enough of them to analyze separately. And again, this is a representative sample of the adult population, and we collected the data in July. So that's the basic Israeli methodology, but you have a similar methodology on the Palestinian side, a representative sample of people from the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Now, just for clarity, I'm going to use the term Arabs in Israel or Arab citizens, because if I say Palestinians, some of you might think it's Palestinians from West Bank and Gaza, but be aware that there are many Arab citizens who identify as Palestinians, but just for the sake of clarity, I'm going to use that term. Okay, so what are we seeing when we look at attitudes towards the war during the war? Again, I'm selecting, just a small portion of a lot of data, but I want to start with one that illustrates what I mean by hardline attitudes. We asked people on both sides, and this is one of the examples where I'm showing you both sides of the data. We asked people what they think of their side's own actions. So for Israelis, we asked the question, do you think what Hamas did on October 7th justifies what Israel is doing in the Gaza Strip since then? And a similar sort of parallel question for Palestinians, we asked, do you think Palestinians suffering under the siege and blockade of the Gaza Strip justifies what Hamas did on October 7th? So each side was asked to reflect on their own actions. I'm not exactly sure how difficult it is for you to see, but this is the Israeli side, and here I'm looking just at Israeli Jews, okay? And the total, I'm going to show you the total of people who said our side's actions are definitely or probably justified. You have 84% among Israeli Jews, where the vast majority, nearly 3/4 of them, say that our actions are definitely justified. What you see on the Palestinian side in this case is a mirror image, almost a mirror image. This is almost the same in survey research terms, where we have, again, an absolute majority of Palestinians who say our actions are definitely justified, or Hamas's actions were definitely justified, another 30% who say they were, almost 30% who say they were probably justified, and in total, 80% of Palestinians said what happened on October 7th was justified. So these are tough findings for us. But what we see is a very similar breakdown, even with slight difference of intensity, between Israeli Jews and Palestinians. In this case, we asked Arabs in Israel about whether they would justify Hamas's actions, the same question that Palestinians were asked. And you can see here that actually a relatively small portion, just over 1/4. Can you see the numbers? Are you able to read them? It's too far. Okay, good, because I wasn't sure. Just over 1/4 say that those actions were justified. And the reason I'm pointing that out is because this is the beginning of a trend that you will see throughout the presentation, where Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel are consistently less supportive of militant attitudes, more supportive of peaceful attitudes, and you're going to see that throughout the presentation. But this is just to give you a sense of how each side absolutely thinks that its wartime actions are justified, and in almost very similar rates. So let me give you just another example of this. We asked each side, do you think the number of casualties on the other side is justified? Okay, and for that, it's basically an identical question. And we did not distinguish, for the purposes of this question, between combatants and civilians, because there's no agreement about how to break those down exactly. But what we see is, once again, fairly similar trend, even with a little bit of difference this time. But on the Israeli side, we have about 70, just over 3/4 of Israeli Jews who say that the number of casualties on the Palestinian side is justified. That's actually a small decline from a survey that was conducted in January of 2024. So, and this is another pattern we'll see, that the most extreme attitudes on both sides are in the first roughly 6 months of the war, and then they start to mitigate just a little bit. Among Palestinians, not quite the same number, but still an absolute majority. 55% in total who say that the number of casualties on the Israeli side is either completely or fairly justified. Okay, there we have, in this case, we have a difference between West Bank and Gaza, and in general, there are big differences between the West Bank and Gaza. But let me point out once again that the data among Arab citizens in Israel, we asked them in this case about both cases. Do you think the number of Palestinians casualties is justified? Do you think the number of Israeli casualties is justified? And once again, we see that very few of them are supportive of those casualties. In other words, the vast majority of them are against the number of casualties, whether they're Israeli or Palestinian, with slightly different data. So that's another illustration of where we see similar trends, okay, of both sides justifying the number of people killed on the other side. Bringing this down to some of the more immediate questions, because these are sort of at a big theoretical level, right? Do you justify the war? Do you justify the casualties? All the time we're getting new information and new developments in this conflict. And this particular survey comes from my colleagues at Tel Aviv University, who also participated in the joint survey, but this is a separate survey they've conducted just about on the Israeli side. And I don't know how much attention it got here, but throughout the fall, there was a lot of talk about a plan that had been developed by a bunch of former generals, retired generals, who were influential and trying to convince the government that Israel should take a much tougher approach to parts of Gaza. And basically, the plan called for basically expelling Palestinian civilians from the north of Gaza, besieging the area, ending all humanitarian aid, and then going in with total force to destroy anybody who's left, on the theory that anybody left would be Hamas. So this plan was considered, completely a violation of international law and tantamount to ethnic cleansing. In fact, prominent Israelis even called it ethnic cleansing. And so the question that was asked by the researchers at Tel Aviv University said the following: according to reports, Israel is carrying out large-scale evacuations of Palestinian residents from northern Gaza, to preventing their return and establishing a significant presence in the area. To what extent do you support or oppose these operations? You can see among the total Israeli population, 64% support it, okay? And that's just because I haven't put the legend in here, but among Jews, the support is much higher, 3/4, okay, a very significant majority support this plan. Typically, among the Arab citizens, more people oppose the plan. In fact, 2/3 oppose it. That's the same pattern that we saw before. Arab citizens are always opposed to militant actions in great numbers. So these attitudes are not just theoretical, they are consistent as we see them reacting to developments during the war. I'll give you another example. More recently, I imagine most people have heard about Trump's statements with relation to Gaza. Okay, appropriate reaction. And when the plans were first announced, nobody was quite sure what to make of them, but this is a survey that was conducted by a media agency or contracted by Channel 13, which is contracting a well-known and reputed survey company to do its research. And they asked, again, Trump is so vague about these things that we're not exactly sure what he means, but the way the question was asked is important. The question said, in recent days, US President Donald Trump presented his plan for exiling the residents of Gaza Strip. So this was a very explicit question. It did not try to say that Trump wants them to have the option to leave voluntarily. It said the plan is to exile the residents of Gaza to other states. And last night he said that the US would take control over Gaza. This was published on February 5th. Do you support or oppose the Trump plan? Okay, here you can see in the general Israeli public, 72% said they support the plan. Now, the television station didn't provide the breakdowns, but as you've seen in the previous slides, support for hardline attitudes is always higher among the Jewish population and always much lower among the Arab population. So you can imagine the Jewish population is probably closer to 80% on this, because I imagine there's very, very little support among the Arab population. So again, the broader attitudes are consistent and inform people's views of immediate developments on the ground. I want to go a little bit deeper and explain one of the sort of underlying reasons for these hardline attitudes, even before we get into the longer term history. Basically, what has happened during the war is that each side was already in a very severe frame of mind about their perceptions of the other side. So each side perceives the other side as having the worst possible intentions towards them. Here you have two different questions. The first one, with these bars over here, the sort of brownish bars, relates to a long-term question we've asked in the past. We've asked it even going further back. There are 4 different responses to this question. 2 of them are extreme, 2 of them are more moderate, but everybody gravitated to the extreme responses. In 2017 already, and in 2023, that middle bar was actually data collected in December 2022. And the extreme response is when you ask Israelis, particularly Israeli Jews, what are the long-term aspirations of the Palestinian Authority and the PLO? The extreme responses are that they want to conquer the state of Israel and destroy much of the Jewish population. And you can see that the plurality already chose that in 2017. That plurality grew in 2023, well, again, late 2022. And 40% chose that very extreme option at that time. But during the war, that percentage rose to 64%. So the war has made people see the other side as even more threatening and convince more Israeli Jews that Palestinians want to destroy them. And then conquer the state of Israel and regain control over all of pre-48 Palestine also makes up the vast majority. The 2 of those together, you now have 77% of Israeli Jews who believe the most extreme aims on the part of Palestinians. But then we asked a question about the more immediate term. We wanted to know how Israelis perceive Palestinian actions from October 7th. So we said, what are the aspirations of Palestinians on October 7th and the current war? And again, we gave them 4 options. 2 of them were very extreme, 2 of them were more moderate. But everybody gravitated to the most extreme options. And primarily, 66% said they were trying to commit genocide on October 7th. Okay? 27% said they're trying to conquer the land and expel the people. The remaining portion said the other 2 responses, which were things like they're trying to break the siege on Gaza, or they're trying to secure, their own security in life. So I mean, things that could be justified, but not that anything would justify October 7th. But in terms of an aim, everybody gravitated to the most extreme aims, or the vast majority you can see here. However, this is also one of those questions where you have almost identical patterns on the Palestinian side. We asked this similar questions for Palestinians. We said, what are the long-term aspirations of Israel? And you can see already from the early phase when we've been asking this question, at that point, almost 80% already in 2017 thought that Israel had one of the two most extreme aims, and the most extreme aim being expanding the borders of Israel to all the areas between the river and the sea, Jordan River, Mediterranean Sea, and expelling the Arab citizens, or annexation of the West Bank while while denying the political rights of Palestinians. And so the minority chose the second most extreme. Here already the majority chose the most extreme option, and that majority only grew in recent years and didn't actually change much with the war because it was already so high. And when you ask Palestinians about the short-term aspirations immediately with relation to the current war in Gaza, when you ask them what are the aspirations of Israel in the war and since October 7th, you see a similar breakdown. 61% say Israel is trying to commit genocide. 27% say it's trying to conquer the land and expel all the people. And the few remaining respondents broke down into things like Israel is trying to secure its people within its borders, the kind of justifiable aims you would imagine. But the vast majority believe the most extreme aims of Israel. So it's another one of those situations where we see a very parallel trend. Okay, and then I think finally at the heart of a lot of what we see in this conflict, and in fact what I see in many conflicts, especially those long and intractable conflicts, is that each side very much believes itself to be the victim in this conflict, but the way we've worded this question, we found out that they actually see themselves as the victim in the biggest victims in the world. And that's because we asked the same question on both sides. We asked people to agree or disagree with, I believe the victimization, let's say, of Jews, because just to explain how we asked the question, we asked Israeli Jews, I believe the victimization of Jews is the worst compared to other people that suffered from persecution and injustice. For Palestinians, we asked the same thing, but just about Palestinians. And you can see the findings are an overwhelming majority. Okay, in survey terms, this is practically considered a consensus. And it's also identical in survey terms. That's within the margin of error. There's no difference there. So you have an absolute sense of victimization of each side within this conflict and in general. And that, I think is very clearly at the root of each side's justifications of its own actions. If you're the victim, you have to protect yourself, and anything is justified. Okay, so how did we get to this stage? In the longer term, what have been the attitudes towards peace, towards conflict, towards concessions that set the stage for where we are now? I think the first and most kind of basic mapping of where attitudes have been going with relation to peace involves the two-state solution, because for a long time, the two-state solution was synonymous with peace. If you were talking about peace, you were talking about the two-state solution. So we have a very general question that we ask, which is at this point, not much more than a barometer. In the past, when we were asking this in 2010, well, only 2 years before that, you had very detailed negotiations between the leaders of Israel and the Palestinians that might have actually led to a real agreement, and so it was more of a policy question. But nowadays, people don't really think much about the details. It's really just a matter of which side are you on. And you can see that over the years, you won't be tested on all these numbers, but you will be tested on the trend. And it's not that hard. It just keeps going incrementally down over the course of the last 15 years. And what I think that, the important point is to note that in 2010, okay, over here, you have an absolute majority on both sides for the two-state solution. And you still have an absolute majority throughout the first part of the decade, but it starts, there has been a slow and incremental decline over the course of that decade. And then by July 2018, both sides fall just below the halfway mark. So you're looking at a minority on both sides at that point who support the two-state solution. And it never goes, you never get a situation again where the two sides go and show majority support. In fact, you don't get a situation where either side shows majority support. Now, basically, when you get to September 2023, you have Palestinian support for the two-state solution at a low point, just 1/3, or just below 1/3. The Israeli support goes a little bit up by 2023, in the late 2023, just before the war begins, for reasons that I can talk about, but ultimately, the moment the war breaks out, within a few months, let's see if I can get this back, the Israeli side falls back down to 1/3. The Palestinian side hasn't really changed, and so you have each side showing just 1/3 support in the early stage of the war. And then in our joint survey from July 2024, let's see if I can get this to work here, you actually see a slight rise in support among the Palestinians, but still not close to a majority, and Israelis as a whole lower than at any point since we began using this wording in 2010. In fact, this is pretty much the lowest on the Israeli side since the 1990s, since the early 1990s, since about the beginning of the Oslo years. After Oslo was signed, by the way, if I were to show you the similar question that was asked on the Israeli side, when the Oslo agreements were signed, this support for a Palestinian state, which was how it was asked at the time, began to climb upwards throughout the 1990s, despite all the turbulence of those years. But around 1992, 1993, you had just about 30% who supported it, or just below 30%. So we've really gone back about 3 decades at this point. When you think about support falling for the two-state solution, naturally many people want to know what are the alternatives, what do people support instead? So let me first point out, we asked these as separate questions. These are not supposed to total 100 because people were asked to respond separately to each question. I'm just showing them together. And the questions we asked were, well, TSS, this is my shorthand, so now you all know the code for talking about these issues. That's the two-state solution. That's just the data you saw before. The red bar indicates a question that we asked among Israelis: do you support the annexation of the West Bank, and what we say Judea and Samaria, with just limited rights for Palestinians? So basically one state in an unequal version. And a third option is one democratic state. You've probably heard of the one-state solution, right? And what you can see, I think, the trend here to point out is that when we asked this in September 2020, the two-state solution was solidly ahead of all the other options. So even though support was falling, no other option had replaced it. By 2022, we saw very negative trends, and by then, the idea of annexing the West Bank and giving only limited rights to Palestinians had overtaken the two-state solution among Israeli Jews by 3 points. During the war, it has become twice as many who support the unequal one state as those who support a two-state solution among Israeli Jews. What you'll also notice is that one democratic state never really gets any traction. It's only at about a quarter at its highest rate and went down even further. Okay, but you can also see how this is reactive to events on the ground, because the change here, where the two-state solution falls behind annexation in an unequal situation, is after what at that time was considered an unprecedented level of violence, right? The fourth major war between Israel and Hamas, which descended into violence between Arab and Jewish citizens in Israel. Everybody was shocked. Many people moved more right-wing, and you can see the change in the data here. And then you have October 7th and this war, which is, of course, much more severe and extreme, and you see the real change coming into play. And this is what happens. Wartime attitudes make people more militant, but I will say that this was, well, the trend that we see is continuity. So it's not that Israeli society did a U-turn because of this war. These trends were well underway beforehand. Just to give you a sense, you can see the parallel questions among Palestinians. In fact, they're the identical questions. And the only difference here is that we don't see the option that we gave Palestinians for one unequal state, which we said it in the Palestinian version for the Palestinian survey. We asked, would you support or oppose all of historic Palestine belonging to Palestinians, and Jews would have limited rights. It's a far-fetched idea, but it's the parallel approach. And we see that the two-state solution is still stronger than one unequal state, but it's not that far behind. And again, here, the idea of one democratic state where everybody is equal, once again, does not get a lot of traction. So, here you have similar trends, but the difference being that two-state solution is still the preferred solution among Palestinians. It's worth noting the breakdown, because remember I've told you about the difference between Jewish Israeli citizens and Arab citizens in Israel, and I've made the case that Arabs are always more supportive of peaceful and peace-related concepts, and you see that very clearly over the years. It's a very consistent pattern. So the blue line here shows you the breakdown of just Israeli Jews, and you can see the massive transition between over half who supported a two-state solution in a general sense just in 2016, and how that's fallen by over 50% to just 25% in November 2024, according to the most recent survey that was asking this question. But Arab citizens supported at over 80% for most of that time. They also showed a major drop in support in September 2020, but still showing an absolute majority who support the two-state solution, and they continue with a little bit of a rise to support it with a very significant majority. So the green line just shows you the total weighted average of Jews and Arabs there, but that breakdown is very consistent. I'm going to skip this for now because it shows the breakdown of self-definition as left, right, or center. I have a point that I want to make about it, but I think it might be better to come back to it later, and also it's quite a lot to look at. But let me go to the reason why, one of the main reasons why you see support for the two-state solution declining. Put it this way, it's not really an ideological decline. The people who are ideologically opposed to the two-state solution opposed it for most of this time already. That's people who self-define as right-wing, what you would have seen in the previous slide. People who really changed their minds in recent years are those who don't think it's feasible or think it's either because there's settlement spread like we've tested here, or because they see the political direction of Israeli society or the political direction of Palestinian society, but for whatever reason, it seems very remote. So we have a question where we've tried to get at this point about whether people think it's feasible. We ask, some people believe that the two-state solution with an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel is no longer possible because of political changes, developments on the ground, such as settlement expansion, and those make it impossible to implement. What do you think? Is it still viable or it's not viable? And you can see the change over time, right? When we began asking this question in 2017, Jewish Israelis just, by a small margin thought it was still viable, but already that reversed itself in 2017 and 2018. Who knows what was happening in 2018? From 2016 to 2020, that's my hint. That was the first Trump administration. Okay, and the first Trump administration was doing an awful lot to make it very remote, the idea that there would be an agreed upon resolution for two states. He was giving Israel all these gifts along the way. And so more people among the Jewish population said it's not viable anymore. And that pattern held. But in December 2022, after what we call the May events of May 2021, already you saw the number of people who thought it was still viable declining significantly. And yet again, after the war breaks out, in the middle of 2024, you see that number drastically changing in favor of people who think that it is no longer viable. Now 63% of Israeli Jews, and not even 1/5 of Israeli Jews believe it is still viable. That is the direct influence of the war, but again, it's continuity. It's not a complete reversal of attitudes. People already didn't think it was viable. Once again, among Palestinian citizens or Arab citizens of Israel, you had very high levels even through the Trump administration, who thought it was viable, but that dropped significantly in 2020 and again in 2022, but went up slightly in July 2024. And another one of the breakdowns that it's important to know is, I consider the left-right center breakdown to be obvious. Anybody who identifies as right-wing is less supportive of a two-state solution and thinks it's less viable. People who are left-wing do think it's viable. This is part of what they mean when they say center, right, left, right, or center. But there are demographic differences too. The number one demographic difference is always by levels of religion among the Jewish population. More religious people are more right-wing, secular people are more centrist and left-wing. But the other thing that people tend to not pay attention to is age. We consistently have more right-wing, more hardline attitudes among young people than among older people in Jewish Israeli society. And so you see one example of that here. I just put it in here as one small example, but trust me, it's consistent with almost everything I've shown you. So that you have 18 to 24-year-olds among Israelis. This is all Israelis, but it's more prominent among Jewish Israelis. 2/3 of them say it's not viable anymore. But if you look at the oldest age group, the 55 and up, only 48%, a minority, say that it's not viable anymore. It's a very consistent pattern, and it's a pattern that I've seen for about the last 15 years, this age gap where young people are less supportive of peace, less aware, less, think it's less feasible, and support more maximalist approaches. Okay, Now let me go into some of what I consider to be counter trends, okay? And they take several forms. In other words, these are the kinds of findings that we see that go against the grain of supporting the war, supporting the casualties, justifying Israel's actions, and leading towards more maximalist approaches. These are the trends that run a little bit counter to that, and that if you are supporting peace, a two-state solution, conciliation, ending occupation, these provide the beginnings of openings, okay? I wouldn't go further than that right now because what's really missing is leadership. But they break down into a few areas that I've listed here: support for a ceasefire, fatigue for the war, political uncertainty, not quite a political crisis, but a lot of distrust in the current leadership, and a changing understanding of the geopolitics of this region, which actually provides an opening for how to rethink Israeli-Palestinian possibilities for a political resolution. So one example is that support for a hostage release and ceasefire deal is very strong. It's a majority of the Israeli population. I'm just going to show you this particular survey, which was commissioned by a television channel, published on February 10th. And this addresses particularly the current ceasefire deal that's underway, which is still somehow hanging on but frozen in a way. Which, remember, that deal was agreed on January 16th. The first hostages began being released a few days later, and at this point there have been 33 hostages released, including some of them were dead bodies. But nevertheless, in mid-February, they asked, should Israel go back to fighting at the end of Phase A, which was this first phase of the release of 33 hostages, or continue to Phase B, which would involve the release of the rest of the hostages and reaching a permanent ceasefire. And you can see that among the Israeli public, those who said we should continue to Phase B, which involves, again, releasing the rest of the hostages, but also reaching a permanent ceasefire, is a clear majority. We have 67%. That's 2/3 of the Israeli public who believes that. Okay, I'll give you another version of this, which is a more recent survey conducted at the end of February with a similar question but more detailed. And this one was conducted by the Israel Democracy Institute, which has a monthly survey called Voice Index. They say that, do you agree or disagree that in light of recent events, Israel should continue with the second stage of the hostage deal to include a complete cessation of hostilities, withdrawal from Gaza, release of Palestinian prisoners? This is something very, very hard for Israelis to accept. In exchange for the release of all the hostages. And here, too, not only do you have 70% who agree or 73% who agree, but the number has been rising relative to the same question asked in January. What you're seeing there are the numbers comparing their January survey and their February survey, and you can see that among the total sample, there was even a rise of 3 points. Among the Jewish Israeli sample, a rise of 3.5 points. Slight, very little change among the left and the center, but even a rise of 5 points among self-defined right-wing Israelis. So it's a consistent pattern. What we see is, despite the very difficult scenes in the hostage release, in the various hostages releases that we saw in this phase, still Israelis are showing more support for the hostage release deal. And I can assure you that I've been watching the data about the question of hostage release in exchange for a ceasefire. Throughout this war, we have seen an absolute majority who support it, and it's been growing as it became more of a reality. So that is, frankly, support for stopping the war. Yes, it is driven by Israeli desires to see the hostages come back, but they know that that will involve a cessation of the war. We have other questions that are testing more directly confidence in the war aims. Now, these are surveys conducted by the Institute for National Security Studies, and I bring in these outside surveys so that you don't trust only one source. Always look for diverse sources of information. They've been asking a question from the beginning: to what extent do you agree or disagree that the IDF will win the war? In October 2023, in the very beginning, 92% of Israeli Jews said, yes, the IDF is going to win the war. By January of this year, that number declined 31 points, okay, to 61%. So it's still a majority, but it's significantly lower than it was in the beginning, and the corresponding IDF will not win has risen from just 4% to 25%, okay, significant rise. Another similar question they asked, are you confident that the war aims will be achieved? In the very beginning of the war on October 2023, 70% said, yes, I'm confident of Israeli Jews, right? 70% said, I'm confident the war aims will be achieved. That number has now gone down below 50%. So only a minority of Israeli Jews, it's a big minority, it's 47%, but still a major decline from October 2023. And those who say the war aims will not be achieved have more than doubled from 21% at that time to 47%. So the trend, again, is clear that people are no longer as confident in the war aims, not as certain that Israel can win. And I think that is flowing directly from people's, I'd say there's a direct line between this and a level of distrust in the prime minister, because this is Prime Minister Netanyahu's, this is his phrase, we will achieve total victory. Total victory has been his slogan the whole time. So when we ask IDF will win, well, people trust the IDF, but they don't trust the concept of victory very much. And the question about the war aims being achieved and the lack of, the decline in support for, in people's confidence there is because they are increasingly aware that we don't have a definition of those war aims beyond these very big, broad ideas of total defeat, which doesn't seem to have any real endpoint. So you see that manifested in public opinion. When I said there's an interesting kind of question about the electoral situation, somebody asked me about Israeli politics, I'm happy to talk about it more. But what I think is interesting here is that I no longer call this a crisis for the Israeli government, because if you look at, and this is a slide not showing percentages, this is showing a breakdown of parliamentary seats. And again, you don't have to try to read every number, but the point is that the elections that were held, the actual elections of 2022, the original governing coalition won a majority of 64 out of 120 seats. That number had declined during 2023 already because of the very unpopular judicial reforms or judicial assault, depending on which side you're on. And during the war, you would normally see a rallying effect. That's what happens in most countries when a war breaks out. People rally behind the government, and the government's support or the leader's support usually spikes to somewhere between 80 and 90% in most countries. What we saw here was a crash. Okay, the coalition, which held 64 seats, was down to 42, 45, 46. It lost a third of its support in response to the war. That's a very unusual pattern, and it stayed that way for the first 6 months of the war. So I was saying, well, the Israeli government is in crisis because there's a total crisis of trust between people and their leaders. What we've seen since about April, and you can see it kind of clearly from, I've dated this to around June, although we do have data every week, basically. I've just picked some points to show you the trends, is that the government sort of recovered to where it was before the war. It's not able to recover 64 seats yet. We haven't seen the government in survey research. The coalition parties have not been able to recreate the success they had in 2022, but they are back to where they were before the war. So they're not doing great, but they're doing better than they were at their worst point. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but if you want to understand what this really means, I would say look also at how people really perceive the man who dominates Israeli politics, and that's Netanyahu. I'm giving you just an example of a couple of very illustrative survey questions. One is from Accord, another NIF partner, I think, right? They are a research organization affiliated with Hebrew University, and in February, just last month, they asked people what they think is Netanyahu's primary consideration with relation to the hostage deal, I guess. No, in general, sorry. Since October 7th, is Netanyahu's primary consideration preserving his coalition or security? 57% say his primary consideration is preserving his coalition, not Israel's security. Only 1/3 said he prioritizes Israel's security. That's a very serious indictment of the prime minister and lack of levels of trust. Now, just to confirm that finding, you have a totally different survey conducted by a mainstream media organization. Channel 13, once again, they commissioned a question that said, what is the primary consideration for Netanyahu with relation to the hostage deal? And you have almost identical data. 58% said his political survival is his most important consideration when it comes to the hostages. And only 31% said that his main consideration is to get the hostages back. So you have, some recovery for the government, but there's a reason why so far polls show the coalition at a ceiling, and they have not been able to cross the majority line of 61 seats. It's because of this deep lack of trust in the actual motives of this government. People don't feel like this leadership is putting the people's interest first. What's very common over the last number of weeks, certainly since mid-January, is for Israeli hostage families to say very publicly that the American government cares more about the hostages than the Israeli government. In fact, they've been saying this since the Biden administration as well, although Biden no longer exists in Israeli minds. All the credit is given to Trump. Okay, the last thing I want to point out is that, again, in the category of opportunities, is that when you ask a question that is reflecting the changing geopolitics, in other words, Israelis know that there is a different situation in the Middle East than the traditional, we're surrounded by enemies and they all want to kill us, despite October 7th, right? Which is the most material manifestation of people actually trying to kill you. But Israelis also know, for 5 years now, that they've had a whole new series of agreements, peace agreements with Arab states. They also, of course, are aware for decades that there have been peace agreements with Jordan and Egypt, and they know that there is a potential to have a complete breakthrough and the possibility of a normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia. This is transformative. It goes against decades of Israeli thinking about what the Middle East really is. So we asked this question in July. Remember, in July, we had already been through an escalation with Iran, but we were not yet at the second escalation in Iran, with Iran, which happened in October. And so we had a lot of questions in this survey testing whether people thought there was going to be an escalation in the West Bank and whether they thought there was going to be an escalation in the Middle East. Spoiler, majorities thought there would be an escalation in the Middle East and in the West Bank. Everybody was preparing for more war. So we asked the following question. What if you had a choice between a regional war that includes Israel, the Palestinian Authority, Lebanon, Yemen, and possibly Iran, or a regional peace deal that includes a Palestinian-Israeli agreement based on a two-state solution and Arab-Israeli normalization? Which do you prefer? Okay, I'm giving you all the data here from Israelis and Palestinians. What you see here is that an absolute majority of Israelis choose the regional peace option that includes the two-state solution. Even among Israeli Jews, an absolute majority support it, 55%. And if you think it's an obvious answer to choose peace, not so for 45% of Israeli Jews who preferred the regional war, because it's become very common in Israel to say that only a decisive war can secure our future. So it's not an obvious choice here. Naturally, among Arab citizens in Israel, we have almost a consensus who prefer the regional peace together with Israeli-Palestinian peace. And you have a very similar breakdown of the total Israeli population among Palestinians, not even a great difference between West Bankers and Gaza, which if I were to show you the Palestinian side, there's usually a very big difference. So what we see here, if you remember, when I showed you the slide about support for the two-state solution just on its own, at the low point, you had only 30% of Israelis who supported it. And among Israeli Jews, just 21%, okay, at the lowest point. When we put it this way, here's your choice, and the option on the peaceful side involves this whole regional normalization idea, suddenly you have well more than twice that number who support it, even though they just rejected it a few minutes earlier in the survey. So these are openings, and I can also tell you that there have been other survey projects, not my joint Israeli-Palestinian survey, who've tested very similar concepts, using similar, and sometimes different language, but always kind of testing the idea that there is a regional option for normalization that will include an Israeli-Palestinian political agreement, but with this context of normalization with Saudi Arabia, maybe backed by the US, and you have similar patterns. There's significantly more support for that than there is for a two-state solution, even though this includes a two-state solution with the Palestinians. So I bet you're all happy to see that I'm up to the summary slide. I just want to go over some of the main insights that I think arise from this analysis. The first one, just to reiterate, war does advance belligerent hardline attitudes and justifications for further wars. So there's this saying that generals are always fighting the previous war. Some of you have probably heard that. But I think that what we're seeing is that the war we're fighting now is fighting the future war, because every time there's a war, we are building up more attitudes to support more hardline positions. So keep that in mind. The long-term background is that there has been a mutual decline in support for the two-state solution, which is partly driven by the sense that there is nothing, that it's no longer feasible, a very strong sense that it's no longer feasible, and that has led to a rise in support for hardline solutions, especially among Jewish Israelis, where we see more support for one unequal state, and the sense that two states by agreement is completely remote. But there are some counter trends that we just saw. There is the war fatigue, there's the legitimization of the ceasefire, okay, and regional diplomacy. But I think that the main point here is that we have stagnation of leadership. Even though the Israeli government has recovered somewhat, it's stuck at a certain point, and there's a deep distrust in the actual intentions and motivations of the Israeli leadership on the Israeli side. I don't even get into the Palestinian political crisis, but it's at least as bad. It's really, in a way, worse. And I think that reviving support for an Israeli-Palestinian peace on both sides, frankly, will require the leadership of both sides to really openly and explicitly lay out a comprehensive long-term vision, which is something that Israeli politicians are not doing right now. If anything, they're talking about the day after for Gaza, or who should manage the Rafah crossing, or whether Israel should be annexing parts of the West Bank or not. I mean, these are very, very, very kind of micro conversations, and nobody's talking about what is the alternative path for Israel as a whole, other than what the government is already doing. So I think that requires leadership in order to reverse these long-term trends that we've seen in place, which are reflective of reality. So I'll stop here. Thank you for paying such close attention. And I'll take that. Sure. I'm just going to get a pen.
We'll take batches of like 3 or 4 questions at a time. So I see 1, 2. Raise your hand if you have a question to ask. Okay. And I'm going to look you in the eyeballs and say questions.
Okay.
I can't believe you're the first question, Jay.
Of course I am. Dahlia, thank you for all your insight and your articles that I read in Haaretz, English edition. I'm upset that they charge extra for the Hebrew edition, but that I don't think you're in the publishing office, so if you pass it along. And especially
but I do have a secret tip. If you know me in real life, I will send you a PDF.
Wow.
Not if you don't know me. So now you all know me.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it sparked many conversations with Trilby, and often she'll hear me yelling at the phone or praising it. It goes both ways. But I have a question about root causes, about religion. I think in this conflict, people tend to, I remember Ehud Barak saying, we're not anticipating Jeffersonian democracy to break out in the Palestinian Authority. But I don't think that religion as a cause, maybe we could call, and I don't mean like religious people are more right-wing or less, secular. They are. But in both societies, it seems that the religious narrative, messianic narrative, what have you, clash. And do you have any data on that place? So when you ask that question about a regional peace, it doesn't really say, well, what is the nature of the deal, and what is the nature of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount and all these things. And as a historian, I've seen everything seems to focus on the Temple Mount, whether it's 1880, 1920, 1936, 2024, 2023, it doesn't matter. So if you could touch on that, I'd really appreciate that.
That was a nice, short question, too. Well done, sir. Okay, I saw... Okay, then I saw there was another hand over here. Yes, okay, I'm coming to you around this way.
Hi. Okay, from a real lay person point of view, kind of 2 questions. The first is, do you see any leadership emerging in the Israeli political realm that might advance these kind of bigger discussions? And then more of a micro question, when you said the word occupation, it's a very loaded word, and I see it hurled around. Like, what do you mean by that? Like, I'm just curious. I really want to know.
What is your name?
Allison Satan.
I want to move to this side of the room. Any questions over here? I see 1 over there, 2 over there. I see you. Welcome back.
Hi, I'm Alexandra. So I'm forming the question as I'm talking. So I have to say that in my family life, in some circles in which I find myself, I only hear the Palestinians basically want to destroy all of Israel, and we were incredibly naive and don't ever, ever, ever believe that they have any other intention, and that any surface discussion of compromise or peace really is just a front for a really sinister plan. Now, I see this data and there seems to be some nuance, and you talk about openings, and I just, again, I don't know if it's really a question, but I just would like your thoughts when you hear this, given your exposure and just given all the questions that you keep asking and the responses that you're getting. Thank you.
Thank you.
What was your name?
Alexandra.
Start with that?
We'll do a second round.
Sure, okay. Okay, so I think the question about religion, if I understood you, was, how does it drive, not only how does it drive attitudes, but is it a deal breaker, right? Are you basically saying that if the sides come to some sort of a resolution and an agreement that sounds politically pragmatic, won't the religious people say, never, it's never going to work because we're too committed to our messianic aims? Is that what you have in mind as well? Okay, let me start with the first part. Yeah, I mean, the first part is that I call it the iron law of Israeli public opinion, which is that the more religious you are, the more right-wing you are, and this is grounded in data. And the biggest transformation, by the way, is between secular Israelis and traditional Israelis, traditionalists. We call them Masorati. That's where you see, just to give you, if you can imagine the numbers, because I don't have the slide here, among secular Israeli Jews, about 60% in total will identify themselves as centrist or left-wing. Among traditionalist Jews, which are not even Orthodox, but they're like Orthodox on a good day, 70% of them identify as right-wing, self-identify. Among Orthodox Jews in Israel, between 88 and 92% identify as right-wing. A small portion identify as centrist, and 0 left-wing. It doesn't reach 1%. You can always find some, but it doesn't reach 1%. And among ultra-Orthodox, right, Haredim, you have a slightly lower portion, about 75%, who identify as right-wing. That's because many of them just don't identify at all. And a few percentage points who identify as left-wing, because they're just, imkral azkal. But the point is, this is one of the most consistent findings in the history of public opinion in Israel. It's never changed, at least not as far as we have data going back. And on the Palestinian side, I don't have quite the same longevity of tracking data, but it's still very clear now. For example, core Hamas supporters are invariably the people who are very religious, who identify themselves as very religious. So it is definitely one of the defining factors. In fact, it's also, it just shapes people's worldview. So like if you look at people who identify as secular, and sometimes even the traditionalists, they just have a completely different view of everything from people who identify as national religious or Orthodox. The second point I would make is that oftentimes I find that observers, by which I mean including Israelis, vastly overestimate the number of religious people in society. Okay, so the number of ultra-Orthodox in Israeli society is about 12%. The number of national religious is about 13, 14% altogether. They're barely even a quarter of the population. Of course, their birth rate is growing, and they're growing as a portion of society, but not as fast as people think, and that's because of attrition. Okay, there is some mitigating growth factors. So I would be cautious about assuming that the more fundamentalist religious perspectives are about to take over demographically. That's the second point. And the third point that I sort of read into what you were asking is like, will it always play a spoiler role? If they're in key positions of power, yes. That's why religious parties in Israel have disproportionate power, because they may be small parties, but they are always the preferred choice of Israeli governments rather than, for example, Arab parties. with only one exception, and that was the change government. For the first time, you had an Arab party joining the coalition, and the ultra-Orthodox parties were not part of that coalition, and it's not likely to happen again anytime soon. So it's, there is, I would say, it's not exactly an anomaly. I mean, there's many situations in parliamentary systems where small interest groups can have disproportionate power, but it's a very, consistent feature of Israeli politics from the very beginning. The question about, is there leadership emerging? This is it's a painful question because, I mean, what is leadership if not people who are willing to state a bigger vision for where they want their country to go and presumably present an opposition to those who are already in power? And no, frankly, no Israeli politician is doing that. The Israeli politicians who are the opposition figures, opposition leader Yair Lapid, an opposition prominent rising politician on the Israeli left, Yair Golan, they still speak in very, very hedged terms about anything to do with the conflict. They're very, very scared to take an alternative view of the war. Yair Lapid was the last Israeli prime minister to stand on the platform of a global stage at the UN and say he supports a two-state solution. So that was kind of radical in Israeli society these days. But the most recent thing he's done is present a much anticipated plan that he was talking about and creating buildup for weeks, and it had to do with what should be the day after in Gaza, and his great innovation was that the Egyptians should run it. So this is not exactly a peace plan between an alternative vision for Israel resolving, the conflict and occupation, and I will talk about the term occupation. And even Yair Golan has been very critical of how the war is being run, very critical of Netanyahu. It's clear that he supports a two-state solution, but is he really laying out a pathway to get there? What it would involve? Not much. And so I think that is part of the crisis of Israeli leadership. There's no opposition that simply has an alternative pathway forward for the country. What I do see is an incredible energy and mobilization of civil society. Just to do a little plug for what Jay already began, my most recent article from a couple days ago, well, yesterday, feels like years ago, was about what I consider to be an extraordinary level of endurance of the Israeli protest movement, which really goes back to, in some ways, January 2023, okay, because there's a lot of continuity with the protests that are still happening today. But actually, we've had protests critical of the prime minister going back for years, ever since his investigations. So there is a lot of mobilization, a lot of energy coming out of that, and a lot of new ideas coming out of that. So the question is, will any of that translate into a political force? Will they be able to make their case sufficiently not to be booted out in this very, very hardline environment? Or some of the more junior members of Knesset, or more recent members of Knesset, lawmakers from the left-wing parties, have been more bold about stating a vision, but they're not very influential right now. So there are opportunities, but it's all a matter of possible potential, if I can hedge it like that. The term occupation. What I mean when I say that is what was supposed to be temporary military administration. Okay, so when Israel captured territories in 1967, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, Golan Heights, Sinai, it established a military government, which under international law is not illegal per se. Okay, Israel captured these territories, but it didn't annex them. Conquering territory by force is a violation of the UN Charter. It's one of the basic concepts of the post-war international order. You're not supposed to go to war to capture new territory. That removed the biggest incentive for war in the pre-World War II era, okay, in the pre-UN era. But occupying territory, especially if it was in a defensive war, is not necessarily illegal, provided you do so under the terms of the Geneva Conventions, which means you have to protect the local population. The administration that's set up must be temporary so that it's not annexation, and should serve the local population, and you should not do things like plunder the resources of the occupied lands. All of these things that basically have, and setting up civilian settlements is considered a form of annexation, of establishing a civilian permanent presence. It's kind of a lot to get into the relationship between that military government and the state. If you look at it very closely, or if you simply want to read my book, you will find out that these two aspects, these two arms of the state, the military occupation, which is supposed to be temporary and only military, is really actually inseparable from Israel's civilian institutions. And this is one of the most misunderstood parts of the whole issue. But right from the very beginning, frankly, you have the Israeli legislature, executive, and judiciary deeply involved in managing the affairs of the occupied territories. But in practice, sort of on the ground, the executive arm is the army, and so it still was considered a temporary military occupation. And that's mainly what I mean by occupation. So it's not been formally annexed. In terms of the question about Palestinians wanting to destroy all of Israel, listen, I mean, I relate to the question because this is what so many people deeply believe, and you can always find a like let's say before October 7th, you can always point to some incident of violence and say that proves that all they want to do is destroy us. And there have been no lack of incidents of violence. There have been no lack of terror activities. I would say what I say about any group, that the actions of some members of that group don't reflect on the entire group, that more people do not commit violence against Israelis or Israeli Jews than those who do, vastly more do not, that you would have to be honest and look at all the violence Israel has committed against Palestinians, including against Palestinian civilians. We don't call it terror because we think of Israel as a state actor, and of course because we think, I mean Israel, if I'm speaking on behalf of Israelis, they will always argue that it's in response to some injury that was done with them. But that argument doesn't really hold up because the cycle of violence goes so far back, there's no one starting point. So Palestinians can always say their violence is in response to what's being done to them. And if you then zoom out and look at the bigger picture, it's Palestinians who don't have a state, who don't have control over their lives, and who are run by a military administration. And so I would never justify violence against civilians, never, and nobody should. I don't think you can look at that violence as singularly Palestinian, okay, because not only is Israel committing lots of violence, but the ratio of Palestinian victims is vastly more Palestinian casualties than Israelis. Just imagine that during the second Intifada in the early 2000s, the ratio was about 3 to 1. Okay, we had over 3,000 Palestinians who were killed and about 1,000 Israelis. During the wars in Gaza, particularly from 2008, the first war with Hamas, you had about 2,000 Palestinians were killed and barely a dozen Israelis who were killed because Israel was in the process of developing its air defense systems. The number of Israeli casualties only went down from there. And the number of Palestinian casualties in 2014 was, again, over 2,000, so the proportions are vastly different. In the current war, you have, I would say by conservative estimates, about 60,000 Palestinians who've been killed. Right now, again, I'm not separating militants right now from civilians because we can talk about that breakdown. But, the Israelis, I don't like this numbers game. This is not to say that one person's suffering is worse than the other person's as individuals. We had 1,200 Israelis killed on October 7th and about 900 soldiers killed altogether. So the numbers are so vastly different that it's hard to point to one side's violence and say, oh, theirs is simply aggressive and mine is only defensive. But most of all, I would start with the basic starting point, is that the actions, as unjustifiable as they are, shouldn't reflect on an entire population. And we wouldn't do that about any other ethnic, racial, national, religious group. So why would we do it about Palestinians? That's how I take that question. See more hands in this direction.
Do we have it in us for another round of questions? Okay, all right. Dahlia, do you?
I never run out of it.
Thanks, Dahlia. It's Yoel Robin's Paradise. This is kind of an extension of that last question. I'm over here.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. The voice from above. The extension of this question is, to what extent can we talk about different Palestinian society in the West Bank versus Gaza? Mm-hmm. How different is one from the other? Is peace with one group perhaps more viable than peace with another, mm-hmm. if one's more militant or religious than the other? And it's kind of an extension of this question of, do they all want to kill us? Well, maybe they do in Gaza, but they don't in the West Bank, or, it's like, can you elaborate on that?
I saw 2 questions over here, and then I think we're going to wrap it up. Okay, I'll go to this one first, and then you.
Hi, my name is Shai. I'm an Israeli living here in Vancouver. I have I guess, behind the data here. This was pretty sobering, and as expected, both sides are equally as hateful as the other, unfortunately. And with this kind of level of hatred and distrust, it's hard to build bridges. My question more relates to my complete lack of understanding and the complete breakdown of the possibility of any form of future, and how the Israeli society, from an Israeli point of view, how does the Israeli society can move forward and live their normal day-to-day lives. Me being objective, so I'm here, right? So I don't really know what the data is on the ground there. But, you know, when you have a prime minister who is a wanted criminal by the ICC, you have 60,000 Palestinians dead. You have, you know, politicians basically saying, no, we'll cut off the water, we'll cut off the electricity, we'll kill more children before they become Hamas fighters. We will destroy, like completely flatten, nuke them, flatten them. And these are politicians. And you have a huge number of reservists. So I'll be quick. So a huge number of reservists going to war, coming back to their families having witnessed horrific violence and committed horrific violence against a population. How does that reconcile in terms of, okay, well, we have a future in this country and we will fight for that future? Because the reality on the ground is there's quite a large a brain drain from Israelis leaving. Not a great amount, but still. The economy is probably in tatters, and I'm going to wrap it up.
Okay.
There's enough in there for 5 questions. Thank you for giving up the mic.
Thanks. He's shy, I'm Guy. Thank you very much. The question is, you share a little bit of similarity with probably a bunch of us, certainly with me, Canadian, Israeli, conflicted. One of the things as an Israeli here in Canada is this feeling that I hear a lot of the failure to, not wanting to critique Israel. It's very hard in these circles. You're sitting in a good position, an informed one at least. What can we do, Canadians, Jews, Israelis in Canada? Where do you think are the spots that we can put pressure that would be productive? Thanks.
Okay. Okay, so the question about the differences within Palestinian society. I mean, the interesting thing is, I could easily give you the reverse presentation, focusing more on Palestinian public opinion and breakdowns. And in general, I didn't show you too much. I mean, I did give you quite a bit of data, but there's a lot on the breakdowns of Israeli society that we could talk about, but I told you some of the basic trends. Among Palestinians, the biggest breakdown is just political. And it's partly driven by levels of religiosity, but there is also a very, very big difference between Gaza and the West Bank. And the difference, I've never seen it so big as the first surveys after the war began. And the difference actually is in the other direction than the one that you were proposing. Usually, despite one piece of data I showed you where Gazans expressed more hardline positions, usually Gazans are more moderate in surveys. And they are generally more supportive of the concessions needed for a two-state solution and more supportive of, not huge differences on some of the concessions, but with relation to militant attitudes, they're much less supportive, especially during the war. They have, from the beginning, been less supportive of October 7th. Hamas got a boost of support in the early months of the war, and it basically tripled its support in the West Bank, because it was very low in the beginning, and tripling its support meant reaching like 45% in the West Bank. And in Gaza, there was almost no change. So there's a major difference there, and it's usually in favor of more moderate attitudes in Gaza. Now, the reason why Gazans are less supportive of Hamas probably has to do with the fact that they live under Hamas, right? And the reasons why West Bankers are more supportive of Hamas is probably because they don't live under Hamas. Now, I heard other theories from Palestinians or explanations during the war. One of them was that, by expressing more militant attitudes and more support for October 7th in the West Bank was partly from a sense of helplessness, that people were so, just devastated watching what was happening in Gaza and couldn't express it in any other way than to say, yeah, I support this. So there's all sorts of theories about it. But yes, there are differences. Having said that, I don't think it would be easy to say, sure, we should pick on this part of society that is more open to making peace and we can work with them. But ultimately, if there's going to be some sort of breakthrough at the political level, it has to come from the political level. The biggest problem in Palestinian society right now that I see with relation to, for Palestinians and for Palestinian-Israeli peace or a breakthrough is the lack of leadership. The governing structures are kind of not exactly collapsing, but have completely lost legitimacy among Palestinians themselves, which means it's not good for their own governance. They're not getting representative and accountable leadership. And they're not able to take decisions on behalf of the Palestinian people that would involve the future of the country. So I think that's the bigger question, in a way, more than are there pockets that support peace or not. Of course, if there is a government that wants to advance some sort of agreement with Israel that will involve concessions, they will have to convince their people, or at least they'll have to convince enough people. You'll never convince everybody. So, I'm not sure if that's a great answer to your question, but that's how I see it. In terms of, the question about how can there be a future for Israelis, I can't tell you how many times my mother has asked me when I'm moving back, and it was during the second Intifada and every year since then. And I say, well, you want me to come back to, right? Because she's in the U.S. So, there's no good answer to the question, right? There are countries that are falling apart. I'm not entirely joking. Does anybody want to move to the U.S. right now? Are there there are many countries in the world that are going through democratic backsliding, the rise of populism, nationalist populism, the rise of far-right parties like in Germany. These are very serious existential kind of threats to the way of life of anybody who believes in liberal democracy. Now, Israel has, some very extreme manifestations, and I don't think, in many ways it is different from, I don't put Israel in the category of Western democracies, to be honest. There's too many anomalies in its political system. It's constantly at war. It's in a different category altogether. But you might be surprised at how livable it is. People are deeply troubled. People are deeply pessimistic right now. The economic outlook is bad. People's outlook for the future of democracy and security is poor. But day to day, you can get by. It's not like living in Gaza. Right? And as for the economy, I should mention that I also thought in the first 6 months of the war, this is it. We can't sustain this war. It costs too much. The estimates of the governor of the Bank of Israel and the comptroller is that it costs like 215 billion shekels. It's crazy, the amounts. But just remember that Israel started from a fairly resilient economy, okay, with pretty strong GDP per capita, pretty strong growth. Israel's economy has been resilient through some of the worst economic crises, from the financial crisis of 2008. It withstood Corona. And for better or for worse, it takes a lot to knock down an economy that strong. Look at Russia. Russia's still going after 2 years of the most sweeping global sanctions, some of the worst ever. And it's still able to fight this war. And it might now have outlasted any political pressure. So I wouldn't assume that the economic pressure is going to drive everybody away. As for migration, emigration, brain drain, we don't actually know. We don't really know. It's hard to get net figures. We can tell how many people are leaving the country. We don't exactly know the net balance because there's more people coming to the country as well. There are people leaving North America and European countries to move to Israel now. Jews who say, well, the rise in anti-Semitism is too tough. So you can find ways to adapt and get by and sort of, I wouldn't say it feels normal, but if you want to, you can tell yourself it's normal if you want to stay. Is it an optimistic future? No. Will people be depressed? Yes. Will they become bereaved families at a much higher rate than in recent years? Yes. But that's not to say it can't go on. Sorry to say. I don't wish for that to be the case, but, does anybody remember the Academy Awards last year? Okay, this year, the documentary film No Other Land won. Last year, the winning documentary film was called 20 Days in Mariupol. I recommend everybody see it. I was depressed because I saw that film about, a year before that. I wrote about it. I thought it was really groundbreaking. And when it won the Academy Award, I was depressed because I thought, it's been so long. How could it be? How could the war still be going on? And I had this very sad premonition that this is what it was going to be like for Israel and Palestine at that time. And here we are. The Israeli-Palestinian film has won the award, but the conflict and the war goes on. So I'm sorry to be depressing about that. In terms of what can we do, oh boy, I'm not sure if I have a great answer to that either. But I do think that the first thing to do is really learn the situation. I mean, you know, it's bad enough that Israelis don't understand half of what's really being done by the country where they're supporting with their taxes. Sometimes it's hard to see things from the inside. But, you know, it takes, I mean, I've been living there for 27 years, and I still know that I'm learning new understandings of how this mechanism works, of the occupation, right, in the sense that I explained it, all the time, because it's really very complicated. You have to understand these mechanisms, or you have to at least understand the big contours of what's going on the ground. If people didn't know, I mean, Israelis told themselves that Gaza was completely free. And why would they get up one day and do these things? It's just because they want to kill us. But it wasn't that hard to know that Gaza was not even close to free. It really wasn't that hard. The information was in front of us. All right? Anybody should have known it. We have, you know, Baruch Hashem, we have a very active civil society, still quite independent. They're putting out data, information, reports, testimonies, documentation all the time. There should be no excuse for not knowing that Gaza was under effective Israeli control, that all of its crossings were controlled by Israel except for one coordinated with Egypt, and Egypt was basically helping to also enforce Israeli policies, that Israel controlled the maritime openings and controlled the airspace and controlled the electromagnetic fields and controlled everything that went in and out of Gaza and limited it severely and controlled whether people could leave or not leave, and the default was no. Every person who left or entered Gaza was an exception. Oftentimes hard-fought court battles, usually lost. And there's no reason why not to know this stuff, but you have to know what you don't know in order to learn it. And so I would really urge everybody, if you want to make that difference, first of all, really get to know the situation as deeply as you can. Secondly, lobby your public officials to change the policy of the country. That's the best I can say. There's not going to be one hallelujah, so to speak. Thank you. Those are yours. Yeah, I have
more closing. Thank you so very much. Thank you, Dahlia. As Dahlia has shown us, the situation is tough. But it is not without hope, and maybe I'll pick up that last question. I think there's a few things to pull out of what Dahlia said, to take home. It's important to note that what is true in one survey can be reversed in the next survey. Israelis and Palestinians are merely human people with fears and hopes, and they react to the world around them. They react to each other in bad ways, but also in good ways. They suffer mutually terrible leadership and the stranglehold of extremists who nevertheless do not represent the majority. Right now, it is not the Israeli government providing leadership to the Israeli people. Instead, it is, as Dahlia says, civil society. It is the hostage families that legitimized paying any price, including releasing previous terrorists and ending a popular war, to bring home their children and their parents held in Gaza. It is the Israeli human rights NGOs and Jewish Arab shared society organizations in Israel who are saying that ethnic cleansing in Israel, in Gaza, is abominable. It is the IDF soldiers coming home from duty who are whistleblowers about the unjust way this Israeli government has chosen to wage a just war. It is the residents of the Negev who have turned to each other, Jewish, Bedouin, religious, and secular, and asked, can we rebuild our burned down region more equitable than it was? This is the question underlying all of the work of the New Israel Fund right now. Can we use the depths of this tragedy to provoke a vision for a better future? Having seen the bottom, do we want to stay down here? Or do we set our sights higher? A pivotal choice is coming for Israelis, despite the feelings of despair and disempowerment that Dahlia showed you, that they are protesting in the streets constantly, weekly, every day for multiple years, and their government does not listen to them. The New Israel Fund is also working to remind Israelis that one day they will return to elections in order to choose. This government has less than a year and a half remaining. Which ideas will animate the public? What visions will jockey for public consideration? What leaders will emerge? It's not the job of civil society to win elections, but it is the job of civil society to propose ideas, to advocate for needs, and to foster leaders. If there is such a thing as compassion for the other side, it will come from civil society. If there is such a thing as a vision for the future, it will come from civil society. If politicians look to see something that will have public traction, it will have been built, advocated, and put forward by civil society. It will take time. The odds are against us. There is no guarantee of success. But we at the New Israel Fund still believe that Israeli society has within it everything it needs to turn itself around, except a little push. That is our job at the New Israel Fund of Canada, and we welcome you to join us. I would like the members of our Vancouver Regional Council, if you would be so kind as to stand. As New Israel Fund of Canada sees that here in our community, it's important for us to stand up and represent these voices of Israeli society so that when we say we support Israelis, who are we supporting? These voices of democracy, equality, and peace. So thank you to Professor Alan Jacobs, to Sid Katz, to Alan Goldman, to Avril Orloff, and to Sam Hyman as being the first of our local regional council to hopefully bring these voices. Thanks, guys. They've been so helpful in making this event happen, as well as Dahlia's earlier presentation to some of the Jewish leadership of Vancouver at the Federation offices. I also want to thank Ameinu Canada for being a co-sponsor this evening, to David Burson for helping promote the event. There he is. Thank you again to Temple Sholom for opening up a very difficult but necessary, sobering connection with reality. And now that we see the situation as it is, we can get to work. Some of these Israelis are pulling for our values. Some of these Israelis are carrying the little candle that will light larger candles, that if there is a path through the quagmire, it will come from them. And so our work before us is to support them, and hopefully we will see a better, brighter day. So thank you for being a part of that. Thank you to Dahlia for traveling this way. Thank you for Alan at UBC for sharing her time. Let's go snack. I need a snack after this. Thank you all.